I think we'll look to make a start. My name is Tom Weaver. I'm the Culture, Diversity and Inclusion Lead here for the IoPPN. Firstly, I would like to say a real warm welcome to any visitors who aren't part of King's here today. So I'd like to welcome you to King's and welcome you to the IoPPN. And for all staff and students, I'd like to say thank you for taking some of your time out of today to partake in our discussion around neurodiversity here at the IoPPN. The aim of today is really to raise awareness of issues around neurodiversity in what is quite a little known area in quite a lot of circles and quite a lot of spaces, is to identify recommendations around how we can improve our provision around neurodiversity, particularly here at the IoPPN level. And we also hope to offer opportunities for you to get involved in some of our work and then carry forward that conversation into 2019. We have a number of speakers who I'm delighted can join us here today to fill this event. Firstly, we'll have a talk from Syng Tan, and then that will be followed by Professor Philip Asherson as well. We'll have a short break for lunch before we'll then move into a panel discussion and open out questions to our audience. Throughout Kai and Philip's presentation, if you'd like to take notes, we encourage you to do so, to really think about what questions you can add, what you can answer, and if you have any recommendations around what at the IoPPN we could be doing better in terms of our provision. Now, we know that high quality disability provision is absolutely essential for staff and students to reach their potential at King's. But not only that, but to actually feel like they belong here as well, and that we value them in the way in which we should. It's an area in which, across the institution, we have made progress, but we do know that there is more work to be done. We want to continue this drive in a strategic and evidence-based way, involving members of staff from our community and also students as well. So as such, from 2019 onwards, we'll be looking at starting a disability inclusion working group, which will be chaired by our disability champion Abbie Russell, and then also a neurodiversity peer support network as well. I'd like to before we move on, I'd like to thank Abbie and the team for organising this event today, and they will be able to introduce themselves a little bit later on around the panel discussion. Finally, I'd like to encourage you to be as proactive as possible in terms of contributing to our debate today. It's only when we have a real honest and open discussion about neurodiversity more broadly which will enable us to make real meaningful change moving forward into the new year. I hope you find this event insightful, and without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Kai, who will be leading a session called Unreasonable Adjustments. So over to you, Kai.
There's a global mental health crisis, states a recent Lancet report. 40 years of drug development resulting in 20 antipsychotics and 30 antidepressants have not improved the morbidity or mortality of mental disorders. Mental illness costs England £105 billion annually. While the single biggest cause of disability in the Western world, people consider the stigma around mental health worse than the illness itself. Research councils argue that such a major societal challenge demands novel cross-disciplinary efforts, and that the arts and humanities have a key role to play. Indeed, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Arts, Health and Wellbeing report argues that the arts can help keep us well, meet major challenges facing mental health, and save money. Through case studies, it evidences how creativity can stimulate imagination and reflection, encourage dialogue and guide conversations, and enable access to a range of emotions, including anguish, crisis, and pain, which are still preferable to feeling sedated or being sedated. In fact, several countries are already using the arts to influence policy and to inform and empower people. So in this consideration of what art could do for and do with mental health, could we use attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, as a case study? Why ADHD? Well, because the issues surrounding mental health are amplified in ADHD. It's classified as a mental illness in DSM-5, and it's also hidden from public discourse. ADHD is also very much stigmatized and mocked, associated with bad parenting, crime, and big pharma. Meanwhile, its underdiagnosis costs the UK billions of pounds every year, and think tank Demos urges a nationwide awareness-raising campaign to make ADHD visible. So I invite us today to think about how visual art can help make ADHD, and by extension, mental health visible, and to widen our understanding of illness, disability, diversity, including neurodiversity. And I'll use my project with Professor of Psychiatry Philip Asherson, and the project is called Magic Carpet. It's a really duff name, but it makes people remember what it is. So, and the project is about mind wandering. So there is a carpet in question, and there are different ways that we display the work. And if you have time, tomorrow is the last day that it's being exhibited at the Bush House Arcade on the Strand. And that's Dr. Sally Marlowe from the IoPPN talking in front of it. And in other cases, we put it down on the floor, and that's why it's a carpet, literally. And last week we had an event, and we used it as a kind of a backdrop for an open mic event. So people stood in front of the tapestry and talked about their stories on risk-taking. So the work opens up a space visually, conceptually, for psychiatrists and artists, service users, ADHD skeptics, people from all walks, to consider our different minds and brains and being, and how we think differently about ourselves and others. So my questions are, can we think about how art contributes to and complicates the discourse around mental health? With art's propensity for ambiguity and play, and access to a range of emotions, could art help make mental health more seen, more heard, more talked about, and providing provoking further discourse, and so that mental health and ADHD are not avoided, not dismissed, not spoken about in harsh tones, and not just a specialist subject for or by experts, and not only spoken ill of, because there's always more than one side to any story. And for me as an artist and researcher, I think that if you only focus on the deficits, it seems like a missed opportunity. And my work joins in the effort of other artists, many of them female. So maybe we could also consider how gender comes into play. As the 2018 NICE guidelines states, women are under-researched and under-diagnosed in ADHD. And if disabled women are already invisible, as Dr. Frances Ryan argues, aren't women with invisible disabilities doubly invisible? Isn't it therefore time to highlight neurodevelopmental conditions in women and neurodiversity in women, and not just in famous men like these? And can we look at it as a hidden problem and a hidden resource? So I'll begin with a short film, and the short film will be followed by a slideshow which is called Unreasonable Adjustments, and I'll be delighted to take questions afterwards. The film. So I am fed up, and I'm literally up to here, and I'm swelling with fury. I'm seething and teething. But I'll watch my language. I'll be civilized today. But my beef is that all my life, that's me, seething and teething. But my beef is that all my life I've had to make unreasonable adjustments. I've been disadvantaged while doing my job of living and being because I'm having to live by neuronormative rules, drawn up by someone probably called Norman/Norma, to pass as normal. The truth is, unlike Norman/Norma, I'm not one to sit in the office. In fact, I hate staying still. I'm always running about, restless, breathless, as someone with ADHD. Yet, as Philip Asherson states, ADHD is the extreme and impairing tail of a continuum. So in theory, even Norman/Norma sits on the spectrum, but they're probably at the other end to where I am. So if I am here on the spectrum, somewhere here on the spectrum, they might be physically maybe somewhere across the river along the Strand or at Westminster, or maybe across the Channel, somewhere in continental Europe. But maybe let's not talk about Europe today. That's another seminar. So that's fine. The issue is not, that's not the point. I mean, the main point, the issue is when people ignore or punish those who are non-Normans or non-Normas. So today, I'll be running through 4 compromises I've had to make to fit the non-ADHD world. And I've drawn up an Excel spreadsheet. Who excels in Excels? Who likes Excels? Okay, quite a few of you. Who are you? Actually, I don't have an Excel spreadsheet because I'm Excel illiterate. I think that Excel spreadsheets are a barrier to my work and life. And the word spreadsheet spreads fury in me. I mean, I spread joy on a daily basis. Here I'm distributing badges to strangers, just shoving down their throat everything about art and neurodiversity. The rise and spread of the spreadsheet is inversely proportionate to my level of joy and the quality of my life. So check out my curve. But look at those lines, those rows, those boxes, those grids. I can't think inside the box. I can't think inside any box. And look at those cells. Is it a coincidence that the word cell is synonymous with prison? And actually this is fake. I just photoshopped them together. And don't get me started on forms. Aren't forms of society's tyranny of linearity? And that includes those forms by institutions that are meant to promote creativity, like this one. ADHD and reading and writing disability commonly co-occur, and as many as 15% of people with ADHD also have dyslexia. In fact, the arts, dyslexia and ADHD seem inextricably linked. As many as 30% of art students are dyslexic, and people with dyslexia are overrepresented in and often excel in jobs in the arts and design. And anyone who's been in an art school or teaches in art school knows this anecdotally. Students don't want to write, they don't want to write, they want to do, they want to make stuff, they want to be in the studio spaces. It is even proposed that the incidence and intensity of visualization is greater in ADHD individuals than in so-called neurotypicals and even dyslexics. And my mind is a monkey. It takes me about 3 hours to write a paragraph and more to fill in boxes and lines and cells. And I haven't talked about the 30 or so ideas running around in my head at any one time, which demands chucking off, chunking together, punching into shape. Yet there have been forms that have been very easy for me to fill up. Like this one. How often do I have difficulty getting things in order? Well, forever. What about remembering appointments? Well, I've got a pretty sophisticated system going on now, so I'm fine. Do I procrastinate? I'll come back to that later. Philip came up with this form, Philip and his team, and this is on mind wandering. Do I have difficulty controlling my thoughts? Do I find it hard to switch off? Do I have 2 or more thoughts, different thoughts at the same time? Yep. So I approached Philip 2 years ago when I was told that I have ADHD, dyslexia and dyspraxia, because I did really well in these forms. So I needed to know more, and I called Philip. And I wrote this with my all or nothing approach. Of course, I wrote a 600-word email. And people tell me, tone down, Kai, it's too aggressive, you scare people off. Where is your British reserve? And then I tell them, well, I'm reserving it until Theresa May gives me my British passport. So, and I signed off my email with, don't worry, Philip, I'm not a criminal. And I put a smiley face. So I did put in some thoughts to my email. It wasn't just sitting down and just, you know. And then 15 minutes on, Philip replied with 3 elegant lines. And I felt really encouraged, and I fired off another email with 30 ideas. And then I visited the Social Genetic and Developmental Psychiatry Center, down memory lane, yeah, really. And the rest, as they say, is history. So my diagnosis brought questions, not clarity, and not one to take things lying down. I wanted to learn why my brain is considered abnormal. And art is my process of interrogation and dialogue. So for the past year, I have been wandering into the minds of psychiatrists. I'm attending seminars, allowing exotic concepts to blow my mind, and participating in trials. And the tapestry explores mind wandering. Why mind wandering? Well, everyone daydreams, and there are artistic traditions that celebrate restlessness, which is why that celebrates restlessness. At the same time, Philip and his team are pioneering research on how excessive mind wandering could be a biomarker as ADHD. So that's where things get interesting. And the tapestry and the art process is where art and psychiatry could clash and perhaps sparkle. So which is also why it is a carpet. It's for myself and Philip and our respective colleagues from our respective worlds to sit down together and chat. It's also for Norman/Norma to come and join us, because speaking only to the converted is boring. And since words are overrated, we also make drawings. So the magic that the magic carpet is seeking is not to seek or provide answers, but to try to open up a creative space for people from diverse disciplines, cultures, and diverse bodies of knowledge to learn and to unlearn, to travel, to wander, where we couldn't or wouldn't have alone, or if I wasn't brash and get crashed into Philip's world. And what have I learned? Well, in any collaboration, there must be a willingness to not know, to feel vulnerable, to see what happens. And my colleagues from psychiatry have been amazingly open. And Philip is a great sport, and he's been really inclusive in every single thing that he's done. And he's paid me to say this. So, and I've worked with many members of different species. I've worked with geographers, urban planners, and I have to say it's not always like this, and the whole process has really surprised me. And the timing seems good as well. There are non-medical efforts around ADHD currently. Philip and his team are looking into mindfulness, exercise, the upsides of ADHD. Understanding that ADHD involves interactions between genetics, the environment, and the brain has opened up questions for me as an artist, researcher, and woman. So I ask, did being born 1 month premature increase my chance of ADHD and explain my disruptiveness? My parents kept threatening me that they wanted to give me away when I was young, but look at how well adjusted I am today. I was a product of a hothouse educational system, not knowing that I was dyslexic my whole life. I only found out after my PhD. I paid a high price with an artillery of compensatory techniques: no sleep, no social life, no food between the age of 14 to 16, kind of punishing your body to kind of create a kind of a mental lucidity as part of a very singular campaign to achieve, to continue to be high achieving, or to try to be high achieving. And Professor Frankie Happy, who's also here today, and her teams are doing fascinating work on girls and women with autism. And they're looking at things like camouflaging and compensation, which I find just completely fascinating, and a lot of, maybe there's a lot of overlaps with ADHD. And I grew up in a place that bans everything, bans chewing gum, bans littering, and it also bans differences. You're not allowed to be different. And people tell you it's your own fault, really. And this sort of narrative perpetuates today as an adult. If you're high achieving, if you've come so far, and so that's a slide on Frankie's research. If you're high achieving, and if you've come so far, and if you look happy, surely you can't be suffering, and things can't be that bad, and how dare you ask for help, and you don't look disabled, you can't be that disabled anyway. So all my life, my next questions would be, so my other findings from my projects are, all my art has been about the restless body and mind in motion, in a world in flux. And I've moved across different cities, different art forms, between the art world and the academy. But is this insatiability due to an underactive reward system in my brain? Or is my refusal to stay fixed my protest to claustrophobia of being in boxes and being asked to fill up boxes? Or of being in small countries and small places. And something interesting about moving across, when you're moving across borders, when you're slipping through crevices and you're trespassing boundaries, the language and rules shift and norms become questioned and questionable by others from other sectors. So a community's gold standard becomes another community's poison, or it becomes something very toxic for other communities. For instance, to my surprise and shock, arts colleagues expressed reservations about joining the same table or the same carpet with me. Many stick to the social model of disability, and they don't want a dialogue with the medical model of health or psychiatry. And they say I'm not angry enough, like I should be really angry. Then there's discrimination, hierarchy, and notions of normality within disability. That's another surprising finding for me. And I guess there are parallels with invisible racism and unconscious bias. And for me, out and out racism is kind of better, it's clearer, that's what it is. There's also tokenism of other differences within disability. And intersectionality comes into play as well. Actually, I forgot to show these slides. Never mind. Let's just move on. So for me, it's when things rub up against one another, when they aren't just us versus them, when it's not just black and white, but shades of greys, when we have messy overlaps, when the thresholds and boundaries are blurred, and we have contradictions. I think that's when it's interesting, when antagonisms become productive, and that's when new ideas can emerge, and that's when possibly some kind of magic can happen. So for myself personally, I've come up with a kind of a plan. So I've decided to be a kind of an ill-disciplined interspecies, roaming the interstices, and I want to be a kind of an unreasonable, ill-fitting, maladjusted chimera, kind of a walking, running zoo, a kind of an animal, a safari of mind-wandering beasts, scampering about, restless and breathless, in the spaghetti junction of disciplines, ideas, ideologies, practices, unfixed, unfixable, with multiple tentacles, of inconsistent length, with different viscosity, elasticity, different levels of interests. So some of these tentacles are blunt, some are broad, some are sharp, some are piercing, all leaky, all non-bulletproof, and there's no magic bullets. So all of these tentacles are dipping into different schools of thought, flitting back and forth different ideas, spreading out, infiltrating into different parameters. And for me, this is a proposal of illness as methodology, or subverting illness. And I think ADHD is nice as a kind of a methodology. It's marked by inconsistency and dysregulation. And it enables a kind of a promiscuous collaging of different frameworks and teasing out different questions and insights into something that could be called neurodiverse art or something. And I like this idea of this kind of a very, very mixed kind of beast to run into other species, to open up other zones of contact and conflict, and along the way inviting others to wander in and to wade in and to engineer a lot of collisions within that. So there's a lot of play, there's a lot of kind of ambiguity, and I think I'm running out of time, so I'm actually just going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Kai.
Thanks.
I'm sure if you're like me, you have a whole list of questions which you're wanting to ask. But if you can hold on to those questions until our panel discussion just after lunch, that would be greatly appreciated. Now I'd like to hand it over to Philip. Philip is going to be doing our second talk today, which is going to be around attention deficits, educational difficulties, and the concept around neurodiversity. So over to you, Phil.
Can't see my slides. Let's have a look.
They should be on your desktop.
Yeah, I didn't see them. There they are. Okay, so I mean, I've been focusing for a number of years on ADHD. But I wanted to think about ADHD, but also think about how it relates more broadly to this concept of neurodiversity, and talking a little bit about some of the work I've been doing relating to this. Recently we've been working with the Disability Advisory Service with Grazia, who does a lot of assessments for dyslexia and dyspraxia and other conditions, and people with learning difficulties, often thought of as specific learning difficulties. And I think recently people have begun to realise that actually ADHD is also a common problem that sort of co-occurs or overlaps with these neurodiverse problems. And in fact, from my point of view, the more you go into it, the more you realise that the way you see things is so dependent on your background training. And we run a training course for clinicians on how do you diagnose and treat adults with ADHD. And now we get a lot of other people coming from different professional backgrounds. And we have a vignette of a high-functioning man with ADHD. And in fact, we don't actually mention anything about neurodiversity in this vignette. We talk a lot about time problems with timekeeping and forgetfulness and planning and getting things done. We don't mention reading problems at all. And after we talked about this vignette, one of the people said, gosh, I would have said that person had dyslexia. And that really struck me, because we didn't actually even mention reading problems. So somehow, because of your training and background, we're calling the same thing by different names. So there's quite a lot, I think, to understand about the similarities and differences across these various conditions. And of course, there's a lot of overlap, huge amount of overlap. So that's what I'm going to try and focus in on. I rather like this, if you go to the ACAS website, this definition that was sent to us. Well, what is neurodiversity? Well, they say it's related to dyslexia, autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, but also mental health problems as well. They consider they're all a spectrum disorder, so they run throughout the whole population. They're not just clinical conditions, if you like. They involve shared difficulties with learning and processing of information. I think one of the common features that seems to come up with all neurodiverse problems is what people think of as executive function behavioural difficulties. I'll mention that briefly. Many people with neurodiverse problems don't perform as well on certain types of cognitive tests. So they talk about neurocognitive functioning being a common difficulty. And I suppose from their point of view, the impact is particularly in the workplace or in educational settings. There can often be, but not always, underperformance. But on the other hand, it may well be that neurodiversity confers strengths as well as weaknesses, and of course that could also be an advantage in work in educational settings. So that's the kind of framework in which ACAS discuss neurodiversity. And so thinking more specifically about ADHD, well, the DSM define it as a persistent pattern of inattention or hyperactivity and impulsivity that interferes with or reduces the quality of functioning in daily life. So one of the issues here is that it's this link not only between having perhaps particular types or patterns of behaviour relating to inattention and hyperactive restlessness, but we're calling it a disorder because it's causing a problem. It's reducing the quality of functioning in daily life. And this is a very kind of medical perspective, because of course most descriptions of ADHD are based upon people that turn up in clinics wanting a diagnosis and wanting a treatment. But of course if you go out into the real world, you meet people with ADHD who've actually never been anywhere near a doctor, and some of them don't even feel they need a doctor. So of course, I think there could be quite a narrow perspective if you only focus on the medical literature. But at least from a kind of clinical perspective, it's sensible that you're defining a clinical condition as something that's causing a problem. I mean, that of course makes complete sense. So it's very practical and has great utility. And the kind of problems that you can link to ADHD are quite broad. I think of them as sort of functional or psychosocial problems, such as difficulty in the workplace, difficulty in educational settings. But it clearly impacts on other things. Social relationships can be difficult if you have a neurodiversity problems, coping with simple everyday tasks, organising yourself, paying the bills, shopping, these kind of simple tasks. There's quite a high rate of accidents in ADHD, and that actually leads to a higher rate of mortality. And there's people link it to risk-taking behaviour. I remember when I went to, there was a group of us in Oslo giving a talk on ADHD, and we went to the local museum, and the lady who worked in the museum said, "Oh, my son's got ADHD." And I said, "Oh, what does he do for a living?" "Oh, he's a ski jumper." And they've got this huge ski jump. I mean, it's really terrifying to look at. And I said, "Oh, what kind of ski jumping does he do?" "Oh, he jumps off this thing and he does acrobatic sort of somersault." He was really good. He was a champion at that, actually, but he had ADHD. So it's kind of risk-taking behaviour, but it's obviously, in his case, was a great strength as well. Because a lot of people with ADHD, even if they're functioning well, can be distressed, by their symptoms. Their self-esteem can often be affected. They often have problems with emotion regulation. And I found that most people with ADHD have sleep problems. So there are clearly a range of problems, whether you see them or not. And I think we're all aware that some people with ADHD are quite well known, and they tend to be artists or athletes, the ones that are kind of really the most famous ones. You know, they're either Olympians, musicians, comedians, ballet dancers, writers. And I suppose the other characterization of ADHD is perhaps the entrepreneur, the kind of the person in the city who's coming up with all the ideas and planning things with lots of energy. So that's a kind of another characterization of ADHD. And of course there are many people, you know, ADHD can lend itself to a wide range of different skills. And so we do meet sort of many people with ADHD in all these different areas of life. I rather like the demolition guy because he wasn't at all organised, but he was great at knocking things down. He couldn't build them, but he could knock them down. So it's like the perfect job for him. And some people with ADHD show up their mates at work because they work too hard and they don't like to stop. They've got to keep going. So everyone else wants a tea break, but then they're working through the tea break. So people get quite annoyed with them because they're working too hard. So, you know, there are all these strengths and weaknesses. And Jane Sedgwick, who's working with the disability team on ADHD in students here at King's, she published a paper. It was a qualitative analysis of high-functioning people with ADHD who are doing well in at least in their careers, in different aspects of their life. And I can't go through the whole outcome of that qualitative study, but the main question was, what is it about your ADHD that is that you're utilising in a positive way to help you do your work? And one of the main things that came up was what Jane called cognitive dynamism, which seemed to capture this idea of divergent thinking, the ability not only to lose focus but also to hyper-focus on things you're really interested in. And the other aspect of ADHD, which Kai talked about, was this kind of ceaseless, restless mental state, throwing up a lot of ideas, having a very active mind, and maybe being an out-of-the-box thinker as a result of that. And one of the quotes from that was somebody who said, well, the ADHD brain seems unfocused, quite scattered, chaotic and a bit random, but give that brain something that you can tune into, and it's your interest, then all that random stuff just goes boom, and I get this incredible intense concentration, and that's great for work. So some people with ADHD are quite skilled at chasing after ideas they're really interested in, and that keeps them focused, because that's one of the kind of core features of ADHD is you can focus, but only when things are really salient. Sort of mundane, boring things, you can't focus at all. So it's this kind of all or none sort of switch between being unfocused or hyper-focused. And so this was also one of Kai's sort of images of ADHD, the kind of running, energetic person with all the sort of thoughts coming up. So in this discussion, it's very important to remember that ADHD and all the other neurodiverse problems are not really disorders as such. I mean, these are traits. You know, they're dimensional traits. They run through the entire population. So what we call a disorder, or give it a label, is very much an arbitrary threshold. We're kind of saying, you know, that there's enough of these traits and they're causing a problem, and so then we're starting to think of it as a disorder. But in reality, these are dimensional traits. So there isn't a natural cut-off between having and not having any of these conditions. And so it's interesting then to see, well, what do we know in the literature? You know, is there any evidence in the literature that these traits could be strengths? So, for example, it could be a little bit like anxiety, where having some ADHD might make you better at certain tasks. Having too much or too little might be suboptimal. Having a bit might be an advantage. In fact, so far I haven't found any data that shows that. So nearly all the data you look at just shows a linear link between symptoms of ADHD on the horizontal axis and a measure of impairment on the vertical axis. And that runs through the whole population. This is a population data set. So there's no evidence of this kind of U-shaped sort of curve. But of course that might be that we're measuring the wrong things. But there was a whole symposium on this at the last ADHD conference. And just to say, so far no one has found anything but this linear effect. And you can also look at Temi Moffat's work, who sort of looked at childhood sort of measures of, they are very ADHD-like, these measures. She called them measures of childhood self-control, but really it was very similar to what I call ADHD. And then she was looking at the prediction on outcomes in adult life years later. And again, you see this linear effect that you have the childhood self-control measures, you know, in a general population sample, and these are linear effects with various adult outcomes. And so the more ADHD you have, the more problems you have with physical health, substance problems, making enough money, single parent child rearing is more common, adult criminal convictions are more common. And we know that if you study prison populations, about 20 to 30% of prisoners meet ADHD criteria. So there are these linear effects, but of course the correlation between ADHD and impairment is a very long way from 1. I mean, I think it's around 0.3. And so there's a huge amount of variation. These are just average trends. So on average, ADHD or other neurodiversity problems, issues can cause a problem. But of course there are many people who buck the trend. So I still think it's interesting to know if there are things that are optimally, you perform optimally. You know, could it be that measures of creativity would show this kind of relationship? But, you know, maybe it's just some people are really good at harnessing it and turning it into a strength. And it reminds me of Belsky's idea of differential susceptibility. And the idea is that you inherit a kind of propensity, or you have certain traits or propensities. But some people may be more sensitive to the environment. And so depending on whether you have a very positive or a very negative environment, it can have a huge impact on the outcome and your ability to function. Of course, a lot of people with ADHD have quite negative experiences in childhood, and that can often sort of drive them down and increase the amount of problems they have. But it's very interesting that in the positive, when you look at people who are doing really well with ADHD, they very often, or nearly always, describe very supportive, positive environments with people really helping them build on their strengths from an early age. And so that maybe drives you up. And it may just be that people with ADHD are inheriting a kind of sensitivity to the environment. So they're more likely to go down, but equally they're more likely to go up. And people with ADHD often talk about living on a bit of a knife edge. You know, the people that are really succeeding, they say, yeah, I'm doing well, but I could easily fall flat on my face. And you've got people like Lewis, is it Lewis Smith? Yeah, it's Lewis Smith. Is that his name?
The Olympian.
The Olympian. And he said, you know, I could so easily have ended up in prison. He's got a gold medal at the Olympics, but I could have easily ended up in prison. So they're really on this kind of knife edge. So I just wanted then to sort of link that a little bit in with what we know about the neuroscience and the brain, what's going on. We do think of neurodiversity as related to neural function in some way. And one area that we've become very interested in was this phenomena of mind wandering. So everyone's mind wanders, but people with ADHD describe a lot more mind wandering than other people. They also have much less control over it, so they tend to sort of throw up sort of many more thoughts in a rather uncontrolled, spontaneous manner. And theoretically, this has been studied in some detail by Christoph and others. This is a Nature Reviews Neuroscience article. And she has these two dimensions, but the dimension going from goal-directed thought, these are people who can focus quite easily when they want to. And then right at the other end, you've got people that are just daydreaming all the time. But somewhere in the middle, there's a kind of balance where you get creative thinking. And so they kind of put mind wandering as a particular kind of class of this of spontaneous thought. And so there is a relationship between ADHD, mind wandering, and creativity, but maybe you can have too much of it. And so ADHD is sort of really very much at this extreme sort of here, where it becomes out of control. But of course it doesn't take much for you to turn that into creative thinking. But the other dimension is more about what you're thinking about. And if you've got pure ADHD, this dimension is much more about the content of thought. And people who are sort of anxious or depressed are often kind of stuck in a rather ruminative kind of sort of repetitive mental state. And because you're throwing up thoughts randomly, it's quite easy to slip over into this dimension because you're already high in mind wandering, and it can easily then turn into anxiety and depression. So people with neurodiverse problems are more prone to become anxious and depressed, and I think these kind of new ways of modelling this are quite interesting. So I've talked about ADHD, but of course ADHD generally co-occurs with all sorts of other problems. So neurodiversity, we tend to think about dyslexia, dyspraxia in particular, but there's overlap with autism, but then there's overlap with mental health problems, there's overlap with cognitive deficits, so there's a wide range of comorbidities, if you like. So how would we label ADHD? What is ADHD? I mean, in the DSM, they say it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, but I think it depends a bit on each individual. For some people, it's a mental health problem. Perhaps for another person, it really is a specific learning difficulty because they don't have other problems. It's impacting mainly on their learning. It can be viewed as a cognitive deficit. Actually, not everyone with ADHD has cognitive deficits. It's certainly viewed as a personality disorder, if people have very high rates of emotionality and aggressive outbursts as linked to it. So it's very hard to kind of pigeonhole it, and I think that's one of the problems. And you know, within the professions, it's generally being viewed as a medical or mental health problem. So you get sent to the psychiatrist. And but the people who work with specific learning difficulties traditionally have never diagnosed ADHD. So even though a good third, perhaps more, of the people they're working with have ADHD, they don't diagnose it. So they'll often say, oh, they've got dyslexia or dyspraxia. And the definitions of dyspraxia are really not that different from ADHD. In fact, in the ADHD literature, it's commonly said that half or more of people with ADHD have a motor coordination problem. So, you know, you can either look at it either way. People with motor coordination problems like dyspraxia often have ADHD. They're hugely overlapping. And so the research that we and others are doing is really thinking about the genes and the environment. How do they affect the brain? What's going on in the brain that causes not ADHD, but this whole range of problems that we could think of as neurodiversity? And we know that ADHD is very heritable. There have been twin studies. And in fact, these early studies then looked at the overlap between ADHD and other difficulties. So, for example, if you look at specific reading difficulties in this work from Jonna Kunze's group, you'll see clinically, phenotypically, they correlated about 0.5. And actually at the genetic level, there's around 60% overlap or correlation between the genes for reading difficulties and the genes for ADHD. There's a common genetic sort of root that explains why these things are co-occurring together. And so in the recent literature, there's been a lot of work trying to find these genes, these genetic signals for ADHD and other problems. And so in the most recent publication, we can see these kind of, this is like the whole genome, looking at thousands of markers, and then these sort of little peaks, these Manhattan plot peaks, show where the genes are lying. And based on this kind of data, you can score every individual in the whole population for the genetic risk for ADHD. And then in this other paper, what they did is they took a general population sample and they gave everyone a genetic risk score based on the earlier work. And what they could show is that the genetic correlation between the clinical disorder and the trait in the entire population was about 96%. So this really kind of proved, if you like, once and for all, that the genes for the clinical condition are actually the same genes that cause different levels of inattention, hyperactivity and overactivity in everybody. So really, it's the same genetic basis, just different proportions of the same genes in different people. So it really is a continuum. These kind of genetic overlap studies, you can look at a whole range of different outcomes. And some of the fascinating ones are when you start looking at things like educational outcomes. The genes for ADHD overlap with the genes that predict years of schooling and college completions. This is kind of work that Robert Clonin does. So there's a huge genetic overlap between ADHD and genetic and educational outcomes. There are many other things that ADHD genes predict. The number of children you have, the age when you have the children, obesity, depression, diabetes. And the one thing about these genetic studies is they really don't tell you anything about why these correlations occur. So it doesn't help us understand that at all. But you could stand back and sort of think, at least in terms of neurodiversity, we're probably talking about a common genetic basis. And these are what we call pleiotropic effects. And so the genes that explain ADHD or influence ADHD are overlapping with the genes that explain reading difficulties, developmental coordination problems, executive function deficits, which are seen in all people with neurodiversity, and even things like very specific things like working memory deficits. So they're not really causing, one thing isn't causing another, they're just sharing, they have a shared etiological basis. This is explaining a lot of the overlap between these various conditions. And we could have added autism to this as well. So the executive function model is really strong in the neurodiverse literature. So they always say people with dyslexia, people with dyspraxia all have executive function problems, so do people with ADHD. And this is a model taken from the ADHD literature, talking about problems organising, prioritising and initiating work, ability to focus, sustain and shift your attention, regulating your alertness, sustaining your effort, also emotion regulation as well, utilising your working memory and monitoring and self-regulating activities. These things have a huge impact on your educational outcomes. And so I think people working with specific learning difficulties are well aware of these kind of problems. But really, we always saw them as ADHD problems. But they're very much part of neurodiversity, if you like. Just something very briefly to end with on the brain functions underpinning these difficulties. I don't want to pretend we actually know very much about it, but it seems to largely involve these key networks. You've got executive control, sort of top-down cortical control, your ability to kind of regulate, like the conductor in the orchestra, keeping everything in sync. But there are also these other processes, particularly the default mode, which normally, when your mind is wandering, is set very high. And people with ADHD and other neurodiversities have great difficulty in down-regulating this, and it could explain the background mind wandering. It is quite sensitive to reward, so it kind of explains why if something's very interesting, that's one of the things that helps you regulate this system, so you can focus on things that are interesting, but not on anything else. And this sort of salience network is acting like a kind of switch in the middle. And so Kai drew this lovely picture of our kind of model of how these things might work, and we think these brain functions are leading to mind wandering, and this actually explains a lot of the executive function problems that people with ADHD and other neurodiversities have. And so I'm only going to end on one just last slide, and then a couple of brief comments. But this was a really nice study that looked at children with ADHD, and they're doing a very boring task. And these colours here are looking at activity in this default mode. And so if you do this task and it's in a very low, boring condition, what it's showing is that without any medical treatment, children with ADHD can't turn off their default mode. They're stuck in this default mode. On medication, or compared to people without ADHD, they can switch it off. What they did is they then repeated the same experiment, but they incentivized them and rewarded them for doing exactly the same task. And under this rewarded, incentivized condition, it normalized their brain function. So they came out with this conclusion that using brain imaging, we've been able to see inside the children's heads and observe what it is about ADHD that's stopping them concentrate. Most people can control their daydreaming state and focus on the task at hand, but this is not the case with children with ADHD. If a task is not sufficiently interesting, they cannot switch off their background brain activity and they're easily distracted. So you can either make the task more interesting or give medication, and that will help them turn down the volume and concentrate. So you could argue that the problem one of the problems in education is things are too boring. We're asking people to do basically rather boring, or just the process of learning is rather boring. But, you know, of course, there are ways in which that could be changed to take advantage of the fact that people can focus when things are presented or done in a very particular way. So it's quite a challenge to kind of bring all this together in terms of helping students specifically. And the way I understand it, within King's we have the student services. The Disability Advisory Service traditionally dealt with specific learning difficulties. ADHD was dealt with by, and mental health, by counselling and psychiatry, and primary health care are actually really helpful at trying to hold things together. But ADHD was always kind of put over there. So what was happening is people would turn up to this service with a learning problem. They'd think, well, it could be ADHD, and then it would take 1, 2 years, sometimes more, to actually get a diagnosis. And in that time, they weren't getting the support they needed. So it was really a problem. And so something sort of basically has to be done about this. So this is what we're just trying to sort of bring everyone together, because the communication between the different departments, although the will is there, but in reality the communication is nowhere near as good as it should be, and the processes aren't truly in place. So I just thought I'd end up with this, that, you know, we're looking at the same thing often from different perspectives. So, you know, Google's quite good, and it came up with this one. Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. So it could either be 4, no, 3. So anyway, thanks.
Okay, are we ready to start? So thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you Philip and Kai for really engaging talks. I've learnt a lot and I have lots more questions. So I am Abbie Russell. I'm the newly appointed Disability Equality Champion here at the IoPPN. This event has been brought together by our Disability Inclusion Working Group, so thanks to those guys that we're here today. I'd like to introduce our panel members. So we've got Professor Philip Asherson, Professor of Molecular Psychiatry at the Social, Genetic and Developmental Psychiatry, the SGDP Centre. Here at the IoPPN, he works on clinical, neurocognitive and genetic studies of ADHD. We've seen lots of your work today, and you've given us a good overview of what your life at the IoPPN is like, so thank you for that. We've also got Dr. Syng Tan. She's an artist, curator and researcher. She mobilises the mind. No. Okay, should I pick out my best bits? I'll pick my best bits of this. Okay, she's an artist, curator and researcher. She mobilises the body and mind in commotion as a mode of interrogation / intervention in a world of commotion. I love it. It's great. Her work has been praised for its eclectic style and cheeky attitude and for creating a positive atmosphere. Kai's work was also on display here during the Arts in Mind Festival. We had it in our reception area. It's very nice. I really appreciated that there. Yes, yes. That's a great idea. Let's do that. Tom, can we do that? The DNI budget. Next on our panel is Ellen Jones. She's a campaigner, an activist and a creator with a focus on LGBTQ+ rights, mental health and disability. She's just won the inaugural MTV EMA Generation Change Award for her disability, mental health and LGBTQ+ rights campaigning. In 2017, she was awarded Stonewall's Young Campaigner of the Year, and in 2018, Ellen was featured by the Observer magazine as one of the most prominent youth activists across the UK and the US for her work in LGBTQ+ rights. Ellen has been invited to speak places. No?
Also, I'm a student at King's for second year.
Yeah. So, Ellen, I'd like to invite you with both those hats, your activist hat and your student hat today. So, yeah. And next on our panel is Samina. You guys have all got this written down, so you can read it. But Samina is a diversity and inclusion consultant at King's. She joined in 2016, working across a variety of diversity and inclusion initiatives focused on gender and race equality, parent and carers programs, as well as managing the university's first diversity mentoring scheme for BAME, female and LGBT staff. She's also helped facilitate the setting up of our King's Disability Inclusions Network, which is a mostly staff network that's in its early days, so we'll hear a bit more about that later. And finally, on our panel, we have Len. So Len is also on our Disability Inclusion Working Group, so she's helped put this event together. And she's also leading on setting up the IoPPN Neurodiversity Peer Support Network, and we'll hear more about that as well. Len also, I don't know if this is useful, I'll pick my best bits again. She's a patient and public involvement PPI coordinator for King's Improvement Science and Service User Research. Their research interests include service user involvement in research, co-production, accessibility and research, and using digital technologies to open up access. So yeah, so we've got a great panel today. Okay, so I'd like to start off. So we've heard about the arts, we've heard a bit of science. I'd like to bring it back to the higher education context. So thinking about staff and students, so what's it like as a staff member, or what are the issues that staff face if they identify themselves as neurodiverse? So Len, would you like to start?
Hi. So I'm actually quite new here. I've only been at King's for about 2.5 months. Quick background, I didn't get diagnosed with what we classically would refer to as learning difficulties until I did my master's. So I kind of just developed loads of coping strategies throughout my younger childhood and growing up and going through uni. So I didn't really know much about what was available to me for support. I just used to always have quite low self-esteem and think, oh, I'm just being stupid or lazy, or all these kind of low self-esteem and having a go at yourself. Anyway, when I came to King's, it was after I'd been actually unwell for a bit. So I was like, right, first proper full-time job for a while. I want to make sure I put into practice all the things I can to keep me well, make sure that I can do my job really well. And I rocked up and I went to the occupational health, and the person I saw was like, what's dyspraxia? And I was like, oh, okay. So that didn't go as well as it could have done. So that's kind of there's been a process of being passed around, and people didn't really know what to do with me as a staff member. And that's how I actually met most of these wonderful people, going, is there any support for staff who are neurodiverse? And they were like, we don't know. And it turned out there's great support for students, but there's no formal support for staff. So I was like, right, okay, I'm going to be a pain in the arse and start something, because we must be able to help each other. And clearly people like myself are being supported as staff members, but it's been managed at a smaller level, whether it through line managers or within different departments, but no one's actually sharing this information. Hence why I wanted to start up our group, which I'll talk more about later on. Oh, my brain, sorry, it's gotten a bit blank. Oh, I was going to say something. Yeah, so basically I wanted to try and share some knowledge and just start talking about it, and hopefully we can offer support to each other as neurodiverse staff and postgraduate members, but also help to teach and to educate and to raise awareness within the department and hopefully wider as well. because at the minute the only support you can get is by going to the DWP, who I thought I'd managed to get rid of by getting a full-time job. You have to go through their access to work scheme, which is actually been really good, but can be quite stressful. So anyway, that was like a kind of roundabout intro.
That's really interesting. I just wanted to point out that we've got the first Neurodiversity Peer Support Network in January, and there's a flyer for that on the back of the programme. So if you're interested in joining, please do come along. I'm looking forward to it.
It'll be really chilled. There'll be coffee. We'll just sit and chat, and it's just going to be like organically created, co-production.
Thank you. Len, yeah, go on, Samina, jump in.
Sorry. Len, I think, articulated what I think is one of the biggest challenges. So I think coming into my role, having been at King's, so I came into this role, I think about over a year ago, but I'd been at King's for about 6 to 8 months before that. And the most common query I got as working in the D&I team was from staff members who thought they had dyslexia and they didn't know what they should do and what support looked like. And to be quite honest, at the time, we didn't really have anything to offer staff. And so the D&I, the diversity inclusion team, underwent some change, which was really positive because it meant we could really rationalise what does diversity and inclusion actually look like at King's, and it meant it really identified a huge gap when we talk about disabled staff, because as I think throughout the presentations today, you know, we talk about the disability supports team for our students, and again for undergraduates that's quite clear, for master's students still quite clear, for PhD students starts to become quite hazy, and then when you're a staff member, it's actually quite difficult to know what support actually means. And I think when you're a new member of staff, it can be quite confusing. For members of staff who have been here for years, it's equally as challenging. So part of, well, I guess, my role has been, what does disability inclusion look like and what should it look like? And, you know, there's a whole lot of work going on, but I think in reference to, I guess, Abbie's question and sort of Len's experiences, reasonable adjustments and how staff go about getting them is a real focal point of, I guess, my work and one of King's priorities. And I think going back to Kai's presentation with unreasonable adjustments, I think the notion of what's reasonable or not, we can get caught up on that. Resources being bounced about through different departments, it's sadly the reality of what adjustments look like, not just at King's, actually quite a lot of organisations, and I think this is a widespread issue, but I think being that we want to be a world-leading institution, we have a lot of work to do. So I am pleased to say that in the new year we're sort of organising workshops to really review what that process looks like. And again, I think what I want to draw attention to is, I think if you're a member of staff who has, and I don't want to use the term invisible, but invisible disabilities or health condition, it's a lot harder to navigate services and support and know what that looks like. And so what we really want to do is review all of that with all the key people in the room, so having disabled staff present, members of the disability network, practitioners, OH support, because I think everyone has a key role to play. So yeah, I think, but Len's experience for me is a dialogue that I hear too often, sadly. And I think going back to what Philip was saying earlier on, the processes, the communication, sadly it is tricky. It's one of the hard parts of being in a university, but there's loads of people willing to make changes and they know how important this is. So I think lots of changes going to come. So yeah, positives. Light at the end of the tunnel, I'd say.
Great, thank you. So the future looks bright for staff.
Yes.
And as a staff member, I see the Disability Advisory Service for students, and I think, great, there's a service here. Ellen, what's your experience of the Disability Advisory Service? And is there anything that that you think that you could sum up to make it more accessible, or is it a different service that should be in place?
I think people can I can tell that they're like, oh, yeah. I think it's interesting when you talk about staff versus students, because there's this, I think there's very clearly laid out things of students, the process of what should happen. The reality is that's not happening for me. That's not what's happens for most of, I work advocating for other people as well, and my experience is that it hasn't happened for me and it hasn't happened for many other people. I arrived at King's a year ago as a first year, tiny 18-year-old thing, with much less cool hair, and I had a King's inclusion plan put in place. I was kind of reassured that there'd be support, that kind of thing. I'm autistic and I also have bipolar disorder, which is an interesting combination. And yeah, the reality was that the support that I would have needed just never materialized. Even getting in contact with the Disability Advisory Service, I could be waiting months and months for an email back, which is really like not great. Or you'd be waiting months for an appointment, which when you're struggling with things that are directly affecting your academic study, which are very out of your control, it's a real frustration with the system. I think the other thing I struggled with was that I had a King's inclusion plan that was very comprehensive and kind of outlined what I needed, but the application by staff members who weren't like disability specific. So just encountering like lecturers or seminar leaders I had who didn't, quite a lot of comments about how, like baffled that I had these conditions because they had a particular idea of what that should look like and what that should look like in an educational setting, and especially because I do quite a lot of other stuff, they had sort of, I don't fit their preconceived notions, and therefore not fitting in that was a barrier to accessing support I needed. And that is what I constantly have to go up against, which in itself is exhausting. So I think it needs to be a much more kind of, it can't just be one department trying to deal with this problem, it's more widespread than that.
I think there is something, I wonder if you may agree or you may disagree, the word neurodiversity, the hint in the name is the diversity part, and I wonder if there's something we can do in educating all of our staff members and our students in what neurodiversity is and what it means for different people and the range of experiences.
Yeah, and I think
well.
also there's something to be said about the relationship between neurodiversity and maybe like other aspects of people's lives. So I'm on the LGBT committee and I sit in, I'm the disability rep for that, and I work very particularly with like neurodiversity and LGBT people who are often another group who are underdiagnosed and things like that. And we also run like a mental health and disability forum because we realised that King's as a sort of overarching organisation wasn't providing the support we needed. So you'll find that throughout King's, I run many of them, we're having these disability and sort of neurodivergence and neurodiversity based events and small scale things that we're running ourselves as students because the overarching support isn't there. So there's been some sort of breakdown of communication there, I think, between, which I'd like to see improve.
That sounds great, actually. Sorry, Kai, do you want to jump in?
Can I add something about the notion of diversity and neurodiversity? When I did one of my talks recently, someone came up to me and said, I've been coming to your events. He's a friend. He's not a stalker. He's a friend. He's a stalker who became a friend. So he has been coming to our events, and then he's been saying, I really like what you guys are doing. This is Mike, actually. And he says, I really like what you're doing. However, I don't have a diagnosed condition. Can I be part of this? And I say, yeah, this is diversity, right? If you think about diversity, culturally, ethnically, you think about biodiversity, it is about a kind of an expanded, it has to be encompassing, it has to be inclusive. So it is about including everyone. So, and this kind of conversation overlaps with other conversations about gender and so on. It's not just females who are fighting for gender rights. Everyone has to be part of the conversation. So another thing I want to point out is the idea of diversity, though. The actual name, maybe people who aren't converted aren't going to come anyway, right? They think, it's not my problem. It's not in my radar. I don't have any problem because I'm okay. So therefore, anything with diversity, then they're just going to switch off. It doesn't concern them. So it is something about the branding. It is something about the kind of the thinking, and obviously lack of education. We talk about that, but also the kind of the also if it's also linked with mental health and so on, you have that whole other host of problems, stigma and all that, you know, like and also the invisibility. It's not seen, it's not a physical thing, it's hidden. And it's how you want to kind of present yourself also. So there's so many of these kind of interlinked issues around it. So it's, yeah, so the term neurodiverse it's an interesting term. It is a problematic term. It is a term that can be really fascinating and great and amazing too. So I think we're at a stage where it is a kind of things are changing, and we can help to define that, I think. Did you want to say something? You're looking at me in a way.
No. I was just thinking about the services, and sort of one of the things that we struggle with is that within the professions themselves, there's a very wide spread of understanding. And I mean, lots of people who work in mental health have very little understanding of what a learning difficulty is, or the relationship between neurodiversity and mental health. And I mean, that whole interface is really poorly understood, to the point where professionals within those different professions will give the same person different diagnoses. And of course they have problems of both. And there's a relationship between them, but there is a fundamental lack of understanding and training in these areas. And I suppose I sort of think, well, at least within King's, I mean, we have all the knowledge and the expertise, and so we have the opportunity to have a kind of gold standard system to support students and staff in these areas. But I mean, King's would not be at all alone in managing these things badly. I mean, it's at a national level it's managed badly, and we're just reflecting that. So I think there's a lot of understanding that needs, and training of people within the different support groups, and that obviously then has to filter out to, you know, personal tutors and everyone who is working with students, but also people managing staff as well. I mean, the amount of bureaucracy is a tricky one, you know, the form filling. I mean, trying to get an ethics application nowadays is impossible. So for certain types of tasks, I mean, it really challenges people with, you know, strengths in some areas, but maybe not strengths in others. But we need to clearly, you know, to be inclusive and get the best out of everyone, we need to develop these supportive systems.
With that in mind, and a question for all of you really, do you think that diagnoses are essential or necessary or needed for people to access support?
I've got just a quick one on that. I mean, in general, I mean, they have some value, but they're certainly not the whole story by any means. I mean, and I think one has to have a more sophisticated understanding at the level of what is the actual problem that somebody has, and then trying to match the right kind of support for that person to that problem. And so the diagnoses can kind of help in understanding, but you know, they don't stand alone. I mean, there's a huge literature on the problems with diagnosis as well as the benefits of it. So it just needs a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding.
I think in an ideal world as well, you shouldn't have to, thank you. I think what we want to achieve anyway, or through the work I'm doing, is just to create a more inclusive and accessible study and work environment. And I think somewhere along the lines, somebody decided that, I don't know, this format was ideal for everybody to be able to engage in a lecture theatre. But the reality is actually, how accessible is it? So I think what we really want to do is just try to break down as many barriers that exist to a certain level, obviously, to, you know, we can't change everything, to a point where we just create a more inclusive working environment. But I think you're right, it is on a case-by-case basis. At some point you do need certain expertise, but I think it would be ideal to have to move away from this idea where you have to prove that you need or you have a disability in order to get access to something. That in itself is, for me, I think it contradicts actually the whole idea of having a diverse and inclusive study and work environment. But yeah, I think, you know, that's the ideal, that's sort of the principle by which we want to work under. And I think in one of the presentations you spoke about the social model disability. I think there are so many different models and various different people align to or have preferences over different ones. I think it's about not King's anyway, not trying to align to one specifically, but just trying to make sure that we recognise that there are various different ones. But I think the social model is one that is, I think, universally across the UK anyway, spoken about and used, and it's what the Equality Act anyway is sort of aligned to. And I think what we take from that is the fact that there are environmental barriers that we as an organisation should be mindful of and trying to address. So I think, you know, we want to move away from people having to prove something before they can access resource or support, but there are limits to that. But ultimately, in the work that in the D&I team anyway, what we're trying to achieve is just trying to create a more inclusive working environment. So yeah, I think it's tricky. I think in an ideal world, everything would be accessible, but you know, that's also slightly unrealistic. So we're just trying to make, I guess, the best of what we have here.
Thank you. I just want to, so I've got loads of questions here, but I wonder if you guys have any questions in the audience. So, yeah.
Thank you. Is King's an exemplar of attention to neurodiversity in a higher education institution? Do you know of any others that are doing this, that could do this and follow your example for staff and students and all the support workers that are in universities as well?
I've heard of something from the UAL, University Arts London, under which you have Central St Martin's, Camberwell, LCC, London College of Communication, and so on and so forth. I've seen that they have a kind of a network support for staff members, and it is for neurodiversity. That's one example that I know of.
I think there are lots of initiatives in different universities, yeah.
For staff members?
Mainly around students, but places where they're interested in taking students seriously, they tend to then also look after staff better. But I'm really shocked that people who are coming in with identified neurodiverse needs
I thought this was
not getting support, because I was worried about the people who come in without a diagnosis.
Oh yeah, so we I'm just shocked that you think that we do get support. The fact that we don't get the support we need is common knowledge. That's why we established all these kind of self-made networks. And it's not. It's difficult to say what the issue particularly is. Sometimes it seems a lack of resourcing, sometimes a lack of communication, sometimes an issue of articulating what specific support would look like, but it's not materialising. Even if the intention to is there, it's not a lack of care, if that makes sense. When I was taken really seriously, I had my kit done, King's Inclusion Plan, which was really good, my tutors on board, all the things are there that kind of should be, and yet, support never materialised. In ways that were helpful. So, yeah, and also I work with other universities across London as well, and sort of across the country because of the work I do, that this is the same there. This isn't a King-specific issue by far. This is a cross thing. And again, we work with a lot of people who don't have diagnosed conditions but are trying to get a diagnosis, and they're seeing the way we're not getting help, and we have the formal letter that says we've got what we've got. And they're put off getting a diagnosis because why would they enter into a system that isn't going to, what's the point in the long run? So it's frustrating, to say the least, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to find ways around it. And I think there needs to be, we have these networks for staff, we have these networks for students. I think they're going to need to come together as well and collaborate on different things. Yeah, because as far as I was aware, it was only the staff stuff that got focused on, but apparently you think it's the other way around.
Sorry, I think it's moved on a bit since I was going to say, but I've recently done a course which is called Dyslexic Champions, and it's about championing sort of neurodiversity within the workplace, and it was so that I could then go into my workplace and be a champion so people can come and talk to me as a starting point. And I think they've run it at Imperial. And I think it's one of those things that filters down. But I also wanted to say, I think quite a lot of problems, particularly in academia, is that if you are neurodivergent, you don't actually get promoted very often because you may not have written the report, And so often people are in the roles within kind of support they've got there and they're very logical thinkers. And so if you've got a plan in place that's ticked their box, whereas actually what we need is more of a kind of continual, we need people who think like us in those roles. Anyway.
I mean, it's quite hard to, although I'm sure there is a lot of interest in universities, but it's quite hard to sort of look at what any one university that I'm aware of and say I'm aware that they've got this good system in place. And I was reflecting on Poppy Jones, who went to Cambridge University, and she basically found she'd been diagnosed and treated for ADHD and dyslexia from childhood, but when she went to university there was just no support, and they didn't even recognise ADHD. She couldn't get the medication she'd been on for years either, and things fell apart. It took about 2 years for her to get the support she needed. But the way she got it, she did it all herself, which is the problem. So she set up a student network of like-minded people, and actually it became quite successful. They linked up with an ADHD coach who had a lot of skills to support and offer people. But there was no formal process, and I think that's part of the problem. You only get it if you do it yourself, and you have to push to get it. I don't know if others would agree with that. But
it's much the same there. What support is available is very, very deep, almost as if it's a taboo to have support in place at a top 10 university in the world. And that's for staff and students and support workers. And we've got 7,700 staff, so on the ratio of 1% population is neurodiverse, we've definitely got 1,700 people who are diagnosed as being having some autistic spectrum disorder. That's the diagnosis.
I just want to add slightly to the point that neurodiverse people aren't promoted. A lot of people are never actually given a proper contract, so they're on fixed-term contracts. So they're not eligible for a lot of the staff help that they would otherwise be eligible for. But because they're not ticking the right boxes and going for the promotion options, they don't end up with a permanent contract.
Can I say something about that? So that these are very important points, and it would seem like a career suicide to say, actually, I'm pretty bad at organising, I'm pretty bad at writing. Why would they want to employ you as an academic, as a researcher, right? So, and then at a previous workplace, I was told to go back to the closet after I said I had dyslexia. Like, ooh, actually, we don't want to do like, and that person also had dyslexia. I don't know why they actually actively say this is something you shouldn't share. So I should be ashamed of it. So there is definitely there is a very interesting tension there, and that is why I think part of the discourse has to be about the different aspects of neurodiversity. Yes, there are impairments. Yes, there are disabilities. There are also other aspects to it, which Philip also points out in his slide. Not all of us are Olympians, unfortunately, but there are other aspects that are under-discussed. This idea of being able to see the big picture, for example, non-linear thinking, and all those things that are also part of this public knowledge or public disknowledge, public ignorance. People don't know about what the thing is, and people will obviously hang on to those little things that they know about it, and then they think, oh, you don't fit that profile, you're not a boy, how can you have ADHD as a grown-up person, for example. So it is a campaign that needs to be attacked from different sides, I think.
Continuing from your point, I think the only way that we can help to change people's opinions is to talk about it more, is to be vocal about it, is to meet up and share knowledge and understanding. Because I agree that there are some things of my neurodiversity that make me a really good researcher. Yeah, I fidget and I struggle sometimes and reading overwhelms me, but I still love research. I don't understand why, but I get so obsessed with things sometimes that I can go off down that rabbit hole quite happily, and I think in some ways that makes me really good at my job, because I love learning and getting obsessed about things, and that really focused attention that you mentioned. And I found it really interesting in your talk, actually, when you said about how you switch between if something is interesting to you or not, and whether you struggle to focus or you suddenly become really, really focused. Because I experienced that in previous jobs, thinking, oh, I'm a bad person, I'm lazy, and when really it was my brain's way of processing. So I found, like, as someone who identifies as neurodiverse, I found your talk really informative. So another thing I tried to explain to people, I have conditions and neurodiversity, but I'm not an expert. Like, you can still learn so much, and that's why I was wanting to get people together. And and a point on like labels and diagnoses as well. I put on the network that, like, if you identify as being neurodiverse or you support neurodiversity, like, come along. You don't need a diagnosis. I've got some diagnoses, some I don't have diagnoses for, but like, it doesn't matter. Like, at the end of the day, a piece of paper will, like, the only positive thing really I see sometimes is it opens you up to specific support or treatment that may help you, but you don't need it to ask for help or get support or be able to share experiences. You don't have to be over a threshold of some arbitrarily, like, decided marker at some point by some clinician or researcher to be able to say, oh, I have this. I think it's ludicrous. It's a spectrum. Like, it, yeah, don't worry about the boxes is what I mean.
I think just in connection to that, but also to a few of the questions. So I think your question at the back was a little bit about sort of promotion and representation and sort of senior roles. I think all of that, it's all connected really. I think part of it is creating a culture where staff feel that they can actually share their disability information. And I think, you know, at King's, if we look at our numbers, if we compare ourselves to our Russell Group universities, we're actually doing slightly better, or we're slightly under, sorry, in terms of the numbers of disabled staff who we have on record as being disabled, but we are still considerably low. And in the UK, for instance, 30% of the UK workforce are to be disabled. So that's a useful indicator, but again, by no means perhaps accurate. But I think partly the reason why we have underrepresentation statistically is because people don't feel confident in actually sharing that information. So I think it's partly creating that culture where staff feel it's safe. They know exactly what they're going to get out of doing that. But also I think, you know, and part of that is having events like this where we can create a safe space to talk about things. I think, and again, I talk about disability more broadly just because of my job, but I think the term neurodiverse, if I'm being honest, I think if I spoke to a lot of people inside work and outside work, I think very few would know what that word is. I don't think a lot of people would have heard of that. So I think it's about the language that we use. And I think thinking back to a recent conversation, so a few weeks ago I held a network meeting because when I came to this role, I set up a safe space for staff to talk about disability, which King's hadn't had before. We're now sort of transitioning into a network. And we were talking about what the name of that network should be, and actually a few members of that group were saying that they didn't know whether they should come along because they felt disability inclusion didn't actually apply to them. They just felt the word disability wasn't something that they identified with. So I think language is a really important part. So again, particularly events like this are really educational, I think, for staff and for students, being the future academics and staff being sort of the I guess, the face of the university. Because I think the narrative is constantly changing and we can only really understand if we talk about it. But I think going back to what you were saying, we as an institution need to commit to actually making sure that whilst we monitor gender pay gap and things like that, we're doing the same for disability and for different parts of, I guess, our community. And so again, part of the work that I'm doing, which I won't go into too much detail, is to really make sure that we have more of a strategy and more of a commitment to looking at disability inclusion, not just talking about adjustments, but thinking about the whole staff lifecycle experience, thinking about how do we recruit staff, how do we retain them and develop staff better at King's. So, you know, there's a whole lot that goes into that, and sadly it's a lot of policy and processes, which takes a long time to fix. But I think, you know, by having conversations, it's a good way to start that. But yeah, I think events like this are really important, and I think it's obviously here at IoPPN, but I'm sure a lot of people would be really interested in it. And so sharing, I guess, thinking about how do we take events like this and sort of take it back to the central college and share out information, I think is really important, that communication.
Definitely, yeah, no, I think this event is definitely a good starting point, and I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to draw it to a close. I think just to sum up, I think the value of community, getting together, talking, use the words neurodiversity, share your experiences, share some of the examples that we've seen today. I think they're all really, really important in spreading that message and educating people. So yeah, I'd just like to do a few thanks, really. So thank you to all of our panellists who've been here today. Thank you for the Disability Inclusion Working Group for putting this event together. There's Charlotte, there's Steve's in here somewhere, and Len herself and Tom, thank you for your support as well. Thank you for our panellists, Philip, Kai, thank you Ellen for joining us. Thank you Samina. I think that's everything. And Kai, actually, thank you for bringing the music because it's Disability History Month and the theme is music. And I thought we don't have much music going on here, but we did. so thank you very much for that. I didn't know. No, that's great. And please do join us. Come to the Neurodiversity Peer Support Network. Join the Disability Inclusion Working Group. I think we've got lots of work to do. So, yeah, thank you very much.